Welcome to Spy Satellites, a podcast about Dune Imperium and the people who play it. I'm your host CJ, and this is Rotation 5, where we're talking about turn order, how it affects combat and accessibility of different spaces at different times. So join us for a roundtable discussion focusing on cards, combos, atomics, and everything spice. Before we keep going, if you like what we do, please give us a like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support us, you can do so on Patreon at patreon.com/hiddenassets. Supporting us helps us continue to produce quality content and gives you access to some pretty awesome perks, including voting for the upcoming podcast topic. So tell your friends and let us know how we're doing. We're always trying to improve the quality of our content, and we can't do it without you, the listener. But I am not orbiting Arrakis alone tonight. Tonight I have with me two fine individuals. I have with me a Lannister. Say hi, Lannister.
Hey guys, nice seeing you again.
Good to have you. We also have the champion of the Imperium Cup, Dreizo.
What's up? Dreizo here.
Good to have you.
Thanks. Pleasure being here.
So our topic today is how turn order affects combat and access to different locations on the board. And so this is pretty broad, but it's an interesting topic, and it's pretty central to what Dune Imperium is. So I didn't have any particular way that this was going to go. I just kind of thought, let's just talk about it. Let's just see where this conversation goes.
I don't mind starting us off.
Let's do it.
So, not just for board precedents in terms of getting interstellar shipping first. There's something that Dreizo and I, especially in the games with Sneaker and Savfk and all that, we do certain tactical moves to delay the queue on the Swordmaster. So, what does this mean? It means that even though at times Dreizo has the ability to immediately get his Swordmaster, he purposely doesn't get it to push us all back in that queue, because we're all lined up getting ready to get that Swordmaster, but the turn order so happens to be him being first in the next turn, so he doesn't mind delaying us all because it makes us have an awkward turn in that moment, or as that example. So it kind of makes us all stuck in a limbo type of zone, and it messes up all of our agendas and plans for following rounds. Like if you see Cheesable's videos, he takes a moment to think about his turn, and the reason is he's not just thinking about the turn, he's thinking about the next round ahead. And when you delay that queue, it inevitably screws up everything, because now everything gets pushed back by a full turn for that person, because they have to spend next turn to hopefully get what they do. And even then, let's say everything happens the way that Dreizo plans it, I might not get that Swordmaster anyway, because I might not draw the greens for that turn that I was supposed to be next in order, and now you're delayed 2 turns. So this is a tactical thing that a lot of us do, and some people will say that's absurd. Why would you delay yourself? Is for that precise reason. You can kind of hostage those people and mess up their plans.
So let me stop you for just a second. One thing I want to point out to all of our viewers, so what we're talking about is, and from this perspective, that's Swordmaster is essential in Immortality. Now, you used to be able to get away with maybe not doing Swordmaster. Even sometimes, I think at the beginning of Immortality, you might have been able to get away with it, but the meta's kind of shifted away from that to where Swordmaster is something you should try to rush as fast as possible. And so now what people are doing is they're queuing up, right? Because there's only access 1 per round to Swordmaster unless you have specific tech or intrigues, right? Or cards that let you break those rules. And so everyone has to go in everything being equal, 1 round, then the next person goes the next round, then the next person goes the next round, and so on. And that's what Lannister's talking about here. So go ahead, continue.
Unless you're me and you play Helena all the time, then you go whenever you feel like.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I'm gonna look at it more from a macro perspective. When the game starts, and I feel like Immortality has really improved the situation on this, but right off the bat, if the game's opening with really good tactiles, I am
Yeah.
talking Minimic Film, Disposal Facility, uh, Sonic Snoopers in some cases, people in earlier positions have a strategic advantage because chances are, unless somebody's playing Earl Memnon, whose signet ring gives you a spice, or you're playing Beast, you need to get spice before you can grab one of these good early tactiles. But when you're earlier on in the position, or when you're earlier into seeding, like first or second, you're able to grab the spice and hit the tactile before anyone else can. Which can be especially important if you're, in a situation where, say, if you're playing Duke Leto and there's a memo quarters up there, you could immediately rush for the 2+0 spice, set yourself up for your signet ring in the next round, and hit the memo quarters. In a ideal scenario, that can almost be game changing right off the bat. It also makes characters like Alessa a lot more viable. I know we haven't seen too much Alessa being played, but at least with between me and Cheesable, I'm sure we've shown off that Alessa has a significantly good win rate because of the resources. But again, turn order matters a lot because, especially on Alessa, it's extremely hard to pull it off in fourth or third position because your entire character's ability is based on predicting where you're going to go next. But it's a lot easier to predict, hey, what 4 board spaces are going to be taken, so my 5th action is going to go through, versus what 7 board spaces are going to be taken if you're playing Alessa in 4th position. The other important thing is, especially with Immortality, with the introduction of the Tilaxu, when cards when there's 3 specimen cost cards, like Stitch Tor, Siege Tor, Stitch Tor,
Stitch Tor, yeah.
Yeah. So when you have 3 specimen cards up, like Peter, Stitch Tor, Gola, you're more than likely not going to have 3 specimens in first position unless you pull off what I like to call the Lannister cheese. You give up full space, you give up shipping, and you hit still suits instead to get your 2 water, then immediately go to research station to cycle your deck as well as get the specimen from the first research deck. That's something not too easy to pull off, and it can end up failing a lot of times, which sets you back really heavily in the game. Beyond those, because of those Tilaxu or because of those cards, second and third position is actually a lot more viable. And I've also seen the meta shift completely, where combat in Immortality, yeah, it's good, but it's not nearly as important because, like, Lannister is someone I'd consider, he's essentially the god of war when it comes to Dune. And every game, especially if there's an artillery up nice and early, you're going to see him pulling out a Paul, you're going to see him pulling out Ariana, you're going to see him pulling out Ekaz, so that he can grab the early artillery and immediately go completely combat heavy. Which doesn't always pay off. I mean, the problem is you have 4 points from factions, 5th if you get an alliance. You've got so many things to do that combat is a gamble. That's kind of going on a tangent, so I'm just going to return back to turn order. But in turn order, it's early seats have a huge advantage when it comes to good tactiles being there early. The middle seats have a huge advantage when it comes to there being a good Tilaxu. And I'd even argue that, just second or third position are in the strongest positions. Because when you're in second position, you have that flexibility of, you can hit double smuggling, get your early Swordmaster, which is ridiculously strong. And if you do manage to hit double smuggling on your first turn, if there is a good 3 specimen card up there, your second action can be Arakeen. I see a lot of people, even in second or third position, they like to hit Karthag before Arakeen, but when you're deck cycling nice and early, it's a huge strategic advantage because the other person doesn't know what's in your next hand.
Yeah.
Now, of course, if you're playing a character like Tessia or Beast or Baron, where landing your faction access cards or manipulating your deck so you don't see double diplomacy and a signet in the same hand is very crucial. Characters like that, yeah, Arakeen might not be the best move. But if you are playing, you're playing Helena, Paul, Alessa, Ekaz, basically any character that isn't going to be like, oh my god, why did I have to draw my signet right now? You're good to go. That early deck rotation, throws your enemies off. Unless they. So in higher elos, we do keep track of other people's hands. So even if Lannister's done a full deck cycle, I kind of remember that, oh, his last turn he revealed double daggers. So at most he's going to have one dagger this turn. Unless he hits the Mentat or unless he draws cards through other methods. You can kind of keep track of that. But also deck cycling is something that again, it's a whole topic on its own. It comes under deck building and deck manipulation. But I in terms of turn order, that second position, I feel like the best start you can do, especially if there's a good 3-cost card up there, is hitting smuggling right into Arrakeen. And chances are you're not even going to be blocked because first position, as nice as it is, in Immortality, you kind of get Immortality and Ix as well. You kind of get screwed over because if you don't draw your faction access on the first hand, even if you end up hitting smuggling intentionally, the second player either gets early access to unlimited shipping, probably for 4 or 5 rounds, which when most games last 7, very hard to deal with. Or in an even worse case scenario, you hit smuggling the first time and you're not seeing smuggling again until round 5 because it's not too prominent. We don't see too many princess players, but when you have players like Badger, when you have a lot of people love hitting smuggling because that experimentation eventually leads to free victory.
It's a lot to unpack there. So, for turn order, kind of just building on that, the obvious side, the position 2 is really strong here because um, your opponent has to decide to give you either double shipping or double smuggling, which is neither good options. So,
Double fold space is what you mean, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
double fold space. Yes, apologies. Um, so it's never ideal, and that's also why the win rate is so high for position 2. Because back in Ix, it was pretty obvious. You just hit fold space and you know double smuggle. So what? There's not a huge benefit for Swordmaster. Um, why is Swordmaster so important for turn order here? Is because the actions of the 2 economy action is very difficult to deal with in terms of interference. Um, how how that relates to turn order is, um, first of all, you have to relate to the resources that you're kind of giving up, and in in this effect, if you're out of turn order and you have fourth in queue, you're losing out on a lot of specimens or research bumps, and that really messes up your entire economy. Just as in relation to this, if you're 2 steps ahead of the next person, you pretty much have a beetle bump, uh, an extra cube, and even possibly an extra spice or an extra uh, um, track bump. That's a lot of resources just from playing that card, and that is why the turn order is such a huge deal. Now, here's where I kind of veer off a little bit from it. Turn order can also matter in terms of delaying things. So I'll give you an example. There was one match in particular I had today with Wade and Badger, and I had the option to go Swordmaster before the 2 of them. I chose not to go get the Swordmaster. Um, the reason being was because next in shipping order was me. The turn for first player was going to go to me. So it was important that I get to second level shipping, and I needed to hit the fold space to get that. And the second reason was because I needed Wade to go 1 turn more than me. So why would I want that?
What do you mean by 1 turn more than you?
So I have 2 actions, and he's having 3 actions because I give him Swordmaster over myself, even though I have the Swordmaster. So the reason is because there was a good card purchase up there. There was Talaxu Master up there, and I needed to dissuade him from revealing early um, or ending his turn sooner than I. So
Oh, interesting.
there was 2 benefits from what I did. The first reason was, as I said before, I was next for interstellar shipping if I had second level spacing guild, and the second reason was because by giving up that extra turn, he had to stay another turn, and I got to reveal earlier to grab the better card. So
Right.
that actually makes a lot of beneficial sense, because the third benefit was my deck was about to reshuffle. So it gave me an opportunity for three benefits there. The card that was possibly going to cycle back in. The second was I get interstellar shipping, which everybody knows is very important. And
Mm-hmm.
and the third is getting the premium card that he would have otherwise gotten. So it's not always that um, being the first person to get the Swordmaster matters. Sometimes you have to give that up if the numbers add up for you. And in this situation, I think it did. So
That's interesting, right? So you're essentially you're basically baiting him into staying in the round, right? And by doing so, you're benefiting, right? So you're saying like, okay, the benefit of him continuing to play and continuing to get actions is better than if I just take Swordmaster now. Then he'd reveal, get the good card, and I might be behind. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting. So manipulating turn order and being aware of where everyone sits at the table and what their needs are is kind of what you're saying. That's what's something the next level for like beginner players to start thinking about, right?
yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of build on that in terms of like um, making an early reveal versus delaying. And a polar opposite example of this is a particular match with Sneaker Dead in the competition. I don't recall the exact match, but what I do recall was Sneaker was put in a position where um, the person's right behind him and is able to go pretty heavy into combat, and Sneaker only had one action left, and
Mm-hmm.
so he decides to go Mentat. And by him going Mentat, it forces the other person to make that decision to go heavy or barely at all.
Right.
And Sneaker had enough resources to basically overcome that. So by delaying that, he basically forced the person to put in one troop instead of four troops, and he ended up taking the combat for 2 cubes. So him delaying that turn order also makes a big benefit. So turn order in this sense can also be used by the delay action, and I think this is where the Mentat is not as valued by people who are not Ildan. Like people assume that just because you're not Ildan, you don't go Mentat all the time. Mentat is a great spot to go. It's one of my favorite spots. I
Yeah.
think when Dreizo's not Helena, he or Ildan, he gets pretty pissed at me because I always take the Mentat spot from him, and it seems like a cuck play, but it's not Dreizo. I assure you, it's not a cuck play. So like the delay makes a big difference because in that example, Sneaker put in 2 cubes versus him having to commit a whole Highliner worth of cubes for that particular thing. So the delay of turn order in that sense makes a very big difference in terms of how you can view the entire situation in combat as well.
So one of the main things that you're talking about here is using the Mentat to basically skip turn order, and I mean that's been around since the base game. It's one of those important notes that this game kind of like plays out. Like you know that this is an important combat. Say it's maybe not a 2-point combat, maybe it's a 1-point combat. And you are, maybe first in position. You could take the Mentat, skip the position, basically meaning you're going to end up going last or have the last action. And that gives you a lot of power over other players who might want to, go in for this combat. Like especially if you're positioned with a couple of troops, you have access to maybe the Hardy Warriors, and are able to throw some troops in. The big trick here is though, keeping an eye on everyone's resources, right? 2 Solari for the Mentat and then 1 water for Hardy Warriors. Someone might just jump on you and say like, I'm just going to throw a bunch of troops in, and then you need to be able to play catch up, right? the weird trick about the Mentat is not that it gives you an extra action. It doesn't. It just lets you go later in turn order, right? So it can be a bit of a trap if you end up with a situation like that where, you have money for the Mentat, someone else has water for Hardy Warriors, and they just go, well, I'm just going to throw troops in. And especially if it's early enough in the game and you can kind of predict what people have, there's not an easy way to get back into it to throw that many troops in all in one action. So it can also have a little bit of have some trouble, cause you a little trouble, excuse me, if you Mentat and then everyone decides they want to go into combat, and then they go like Hardy Warriors, Carthag, Arakeen, and then you're suddenly out of options, and so that's where keeping an eye on what other people are potentially thinking about doing and get that be on the pulse of other players' intentions in this round.
Yeah, in the combat sense, that makes a lot of it has a huge value in delaying your turn. One of the things I feel that indirectly would balance turn order is just if the introduction 4 combats that are just either double bumps or 1 bump with 2 intrigues or double shipping with 1 troop, versus you could end up having Battle of Terrible Purpose, Arakeen, Carthag, Imperial Basin, everything is non-stop combat. The thing is, we see a lot of combats where, especially when it's 1 faction bump and 2 intrigue combats, or when it's a double shipping with 1 troop combat, a lot of times people won't commit because it's, how is a whole shipping rotation the same as a victory point? Or how is 6 Solari super important when it's round 7 next turn? Unless you have purpose for that 6 Solari. Now, the thing is, in the current meta of the game, or the current state of the game, I feel like partially why turn order is so important is because all the priority comes under faction access or shipping. Because unless you buy Imperium Row cards, unless you manage to acquire those cards that are important, the cards that will get you access, you are kind of stuck in a situation or limbo where earlier today, I had a game where I was in first position, Lannister was third, the 4th position player was playing Paul, and the 2nd position player was playing Ilban. Lannister was playing Ekaz, and I think my character was Alessa, if I'm not mistaken. But Lanny, do you remember what I was?
Which
Alessa or Helena? Helena, sorry. I was playing Helena, my usual.
Then you were 3rd position, I was 1st position.
No, you were 3rd, I was 1st, because you got the... I shipped first action, first turn, and you took the memo corp, or you took the artillery with your signet ring, with the Benny Gesserit card that lets you discard Test of Humanity.
Oh, okay, that was that game. Okay, there was 2 games that we did where I was 1st and 3rd. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
yeah.
in situations like that, it's not necessarily linked turn order specifically. When you kind of understand people's playstyles, you know what you're expecting. In that game, I'm in first position. People that play with me know that I prefer deck building, faction chasing. That's where my strategy. People that play with Lannister know that he very heavily prioritizes combat, like God of War.
Yeah.
In second position, I believe, was Q32, who heavily goes into deck building, and his entire strategy revolves around snowballing through the game. And in the 4th position, we had a random person that we don't really know. He's not a community regular. We don't have that kind of analysis on, what kind of player is he? Because especially through the tournaments, when you've seen people play tournament matches, you're on the spotlight. You're pulling off the strategy you're most comfortable. When there's a lack of victory points in combat, those strategies and what turn you're or where you're seated. Again, this is kind of not exactly turn order, but more seating. But because the seating and the turn order are, essentially they're just linked. There's no situation where the person sitting behind you, whether they're 3rd position or 4th position, makes a huge difference. But when the person behind you is seated and you know that that person loves going combat heavy, or that person is, if that person's playing a beast and 1 seat ahead of them, you are playing Ariana. It's very understandable that the beast is going to want to go combat heavy. We very rarely see a beast who spends the entire game shipping and chasing alliances, because the signet ring favors combat. When you're in a situation like that, your turn order can really screw you up. I feel like a way of working around that is rebalancing at least the combat 2s to have more victory points. Some people might say that, hey, you know what, 6 Solari, especially if it comes up on round 2, is huge combat to win. But when that same combat shows up, and I understand it's the randomness of the game, you can't guarantee what combat there is. But I feel like we need to shrink down the combats that serve no purpose, or the combats that don't give you a victory. Maybe reorganize the shuffling so that combat 5 and 6 is always guaranteed to be a VP with the other ones. Because it's, and Dick Lannister would agree, because he's very combat focused, that it's always a feels bad man when it's round 6. When you've picked up an early spy satellites and the 5th combat is a bump with 2 intrigues and then the 6th combat is 6 Solari. It really sets you back in the game.
Sure, but okay, let's hold on a second. We're getting into the realm of homebrew stuff, and we could save that for another podcast because I think that that's also an important and interesting topic and something worth talking about. But I want to stay to this topic. So one of the interesting things that you were talking about just now is that turn order is intertwined. I think it was kind of what you're saying with seeding. Obviously, that's pretty clearly true, right? I think that those first 2 rounds, from what I hear you and Lannister saying, those are the most important rounds for determining what you're setting yourself up to do, both tempo-wise, for combat, for deck building, and those sorts of things. And you really have to focus on making those aspects of your strategy shine with your space choices and things like that. So if you're going to be going for instance, a lot of track climbing, and you're particularly good at track climbing, if you're in seat 2, you're going to be better positioned to do that. Possibly in seat 3, if like 2 doesn't go and 1 goes for early smuggling or something like that, which seems to be more and more prevalent nowadays. And so maybe those sorts of things need to be paid attention to. Where does the first player go? What do they open up for you, right? Like if the first player goes smuggling, that opens up fold space for you, possibly, or maybe even still suits into draw from research station, trying to get those deck building kind of things going, right? Those kinds of things rolling. Or even if the second player goes fold space, then now the third position player now has those options. So these things kind of like fall into place maybe, or trickle down the options. So what do you think about how seeding affects the ways players pick up those pieces and translate them into victories?
For me, I think it's actually very important to note what Dreizo said earlier in terms of knowing your opponent. This is why in the group stages, it's a lot easier to pick up wins, in my opinion, because you get acclimatized to your opponents. You kind of observe them, stuff like that. I'll give you a good example. If I'm position 1 and there's a Stitch Horror out there, I'm fairly certain Dreizo knows that I'm going still suits, and then I'm going to hit research station. And so he's going to pick something in turn order to benefit heavily off of that. So he hasn't chosen that because he rarely is seated behind me, but he could even go as bold as Yuna or Hundro or something to that effect, because he knows that he'll have access to smuggling or he'll have access to shipping. So knowing your opponent's in turn order is actually very important, because they can enable you to do certain things if your opponent is experienced enough that they are comfortable going out of the meta starting plays. So this is part of why I upset Dreizo at times, because I consider myself an unorthodox player, and when I do these unorthodox plays, it opens up and accelerates the person behind me, and so it becomes a bit of a race. So like I get acceleration in certain areas, and that person behind me gets acceleration in certain areas, and Dreizo's left holding, rags, I guess. So the homework on the player makes a big difference, and I think that's where Dreizo and I shine in tournaments, is because we familiarize ourselves with our opponents, and we kind of utilize that information in turn order to our advantage, because we know certain players, certain styles will play a certain way, and we'll take advantage of that.
And sorry, just to go back on rebalancing combats and guaranteeing round 5 and round 6 end up being VPs. The reason I say that is because in the current way the game works, in round 1, if there is a VP combat, chances are, as player 1, Hardy Warriors is not coming all the way back. Same type of thing goes for player 2. Yeah, you get your full space and you get your smuggling, but unless you're playing a beast, usually it's at the cost of the combat. Now, when we get to round 7 of the game, the person who starts third at the start of the game always has the biggest advantage. Because if the person in third has, if they've already garrisoned their troops, if they already have their 6 spice, they get that, number 1 priority for Highland, which is something that is massive, especially when there's a 2 victory point combat. And say the person in turn 3, right? In a standard game, player 1 hits full space, player 2 hits smuggling twice, player 3 might jump into combat, especially if it's one of those get a faction bump as well as the spice combats. You hit round 2, player 2 is hitting smuggling again, player 3 gets first dibs on full space, now they're the first to hit the 2 influence. In a situation like that, it happens all the time. I've seen it happen too often. Player 3 starts to snowball because not only did that person get priority access to smuggling because he has 2 influence before anyone else. Round 3, he's shipping. Round 4, assuming player 1 drew faction access and gets the second bump. Player 1 now has shipping access. Round 5, player 1 is shipping, but then round 6 and 7, player 3 is shipping again, effectively giving the person in third position 3 shipping rotation. Plus, you add the fact that the specimen cards are very game-changing in a lot of situations, and players 2 and 3 have the highest chance of getting first dibs of them. Unless an extra card is being drawn by player 2, more than likely it's player 3 that's revealing the third specimen as their first action on their reveal turn on round 3. Player 3 is going to be the first to reveal the third specimen that gets them one of those coveted cards, unless someone is deck. So when you add those things into, like, when you factor those in, player 1, the reason we're seeing win rates are down is because player 1 either gets first dibs on an action on round 1 where they can't really give player 2 free reign, or they get first dibs on an action on round 5 where 5 is usually not a huge round. Sure, if an important thing shows up like Battle for Imperial Basin, that player 1 is at an advantage. But if you're in a crap combat as player 1 on round 5, or even as player 2 on round 5, you're stuck in an awkward situation where it's like, okay, first you smuggle if you took the full space access, then what? Right? Meanwhile,
I guess that's a good question. What do they do then? I mean, what should those positions do when they're not ready to take out combat?
That's the problem, because especially in round 5, chances are at least 2 people have swordman. So 2 people have 3 turns each. Player 1, hypothetically, if they manage to get shipping on round 4. On round 5, this is the first time that they're getting to hit shipping, where if they managed to hit smuggling previously, fine, they can do a full level 2 rotation. But if they haven't managed to hit smuggling previously, which is very likely, they're going to get a double bump onto level 2, where again, they're stuck until they can get smuggling access again. In a hypothetical situation, or I'm sure if we actually deep dive into the statistics of this, player 4 and player 1 are in a situation of, if player 3 took shipping, player 4 probably doesn't want shipping. So player 1 has unlocked it on round 4. Player 4, because player 3 is going for shipping, has managed to hit smuggling once on round 3, and then he hits it a second time on round 4, which means on round 5, or which means the person in first position, because round 1 and 2, player 2 hit smuggling. Round 3 and 4, player 4 hit smuggling. On round 5, there's a good chance that both player 2 and player 4 have their Swordmaster. Player 3 may or may not have their Swordmaster, but based on the game that they have had, they've probably gotten their shipping to level 2. Player 1 on round 5 does their first action getting their shipping cargo up to level 2. Player 2 probably doesn't want to hit shipping or hit the baby smuggling as their first option because it's not that much of a priority, which means player 3 then gets to hit it and set themselves up for Swordmaster. Now, by the time the turn has come around, towards the second rotation of round 5, I'm talking player 1 did double smuggle as their first action. As their second action, they're figuring out what to do. In most games, player 2 and 4 will already have their Swordmaster. Player 3 would have hit smuggling to get the balanced Solari to then get their Swordmaster. So player 1 is in this situation of, if they're entering combat now, they're overcommitting to combat, because you may or may not know how many people are already in the combat. Chances are you decide to opt out of combat entirely. If you are doing that, what's your alternative move? Because player 2 and 4 already have their Swordmaster. So priority spaces like research, not research, the spend 2 spice, trash a card to draw 2 cards. Selective breeding would have already been taken. Still suits would have already been taken. Fold space is likely open, but again, if you're shipping, you already have 2 influence. So are you chasing that alliance now? And in a lot of cases, wealth would also be taken on that situation because there's just nothing left to do. So you're in that situation of either on a good note, you're getting a good chunk of spice if you have the water for it. On a bad note, and in most situations, you're playing your action into either Carthag or Arakeen, and you're having to early overcommit into a combat that may or may not be won by you because all 3 players ahead of you have 1 action each. Then you do your reveal turn, then they do their reveal turns, where if they have cards like double cross, reinforcement, etc., you're kind of screwed. It's this meta that really punishes the person who's first in turn order more than any other seat in the current way the game is situated. But I feel like if we rebalanced combats right now, it's like, hey, and like rebalancing combat is my ideology on how we can fix it. Because in the current state, it's like, cool, if it's a good combat and you happen to be on one of those turns where you're forced into Carthag or Arakeen, you're winning out of it. But if it's not a good round, you're basically forced into it. So what else can you do? And the problem with some combats not being as good as others is you have combat-heavy players, again, like Lannister, that disrupt the meta of the flow, or they disrupt the flow of the game. Because if you have 4 high-level players playing, they understand that, hey, if you're playing and you need to get victory points, sure, you want to win a few combats. The ideal strategy is, you want to win 1 victory point combat prior to round 7, and then either try to win round 7 itself or set yourself up to know that the game's ending on round 7. Turn order makes a huge difference in that, because again, at the end of round 5, player 3 is getting their Swordmaster, and at the end of, or at the start or at the end of round 6 is when player 1 is getting their Swordmaster. Assuming extra Solari hasn't shown up from combat, or player 1 didn't manage to get 4 spies.
Like Inspire.
Inspire. So in most situations, player 1 is only getting their Swordmaster on round 6. When we're in a meta where most games end on round 7, you're only really getting 15, maximum 16 actions throughout the game. But player 2, who got their Swordmaster, most like in a perfect world, player 2 hits smuggling, wealth, smuggles again, gets Swordmaster round. By doing that, and in high elo games, nobody lets that happen. Everyone blocks it. Everyone will, if they see that you are player 2 and you've smuggled, somebody's going to block wealth just to make sure you don't get an early Swordmaster. In most situations like that, it's, if player 2 doesn't get blocked, if hypothetically wealth is also available, but the combat also gives you 2 Solari for either 2nd or 3rd place, player 2 is guaranteed to get that Swordmaster on round 2, unless their hand drew incredibly bad. And then that's an extra 5 rounds with an extra action. So compared to player 1 that's taking on average 15 actions a game, player 2's average is probably closer to 20 actions. And there's nothing anybody can do to disrupt that. And those 5 extra actions, we have atomics in Immortality, which, it helps. But 5 extra actions is the difference between, hey, do I overcommit now or do I wait to see what other people do and then jump into combat later? You can get a lot of freebies just by being in that turn order.
So do you think that there's a way as like a, say, first player to preemptively disrupt that? Like maybe going for still suits to like 4 spice, I don't know, getting up to conspire and trying to bully people out of combat with the truce while getting some Solari for their Swordmaster for like round 4. Do you think that's a feasible way to play, or is it just a little bit too pie in the sky?
So the most important thing in Dune is action economy. And I feel like that is something most of the newer players in the game struggle with. When it's round 7, or not round 7, but when it's like round 5 in the game and you're like, oh my god, there's a Lady Jessica up there, you could hit your dagger to high council by a spice must flow, or you could do a suboptimal move like hit tech negotiation to buy Jessica. Well, you're getting a card that's really good, but you have to take into factor so many Wow, English is hard today. You have to take into consideration so many factors, including, am I really going to see this card again? Even if it's not a Jessica, if it's a Kwisatz and you have 8 influence and you have a dagger in your hand, you could go to Tech Negotiation, buy a Spiceless Flow, or you could buy a Kwisatz. Chances are you might only see the Kwisatz twice. Are you really going to benefit from that over buying a Spiceless Flow at that stage of the game? And that's something I see in a lot of games, even in the tournament games and a lot of matches I won. It surprised me how people were willing to give up Spiceless Flows because of other combos where it's like, oh, okay, cool, you might see a Sayadina, but it may or may not be a point. The Spiceless Flow is a guaranteed point. Now, in the other situation where, say, player 1 hits Still Suits and then they hit Research Station, it doesn't change. All it's doing is essentially turning player 1 into player 4. But with no penalty towards player 2, 3. The only person that ends up losing in a situation like that, I think, is player 4. A move like that just makes player 4 even weaker instead of player 1 the weakest. And the reason I say this is because player 2 still has that flexibility and the freedom of saying, I can either double smuggle or I can double fold space. And that's even worse because if you're forcing player 2 into double fold space, if they have double diplomacy in their hand on that turn, it's not going to work out for them. They're better off going Swordmaster. And then you're stuck in a situation, and then you put player 3 in that spotlight of, okay, does player 3 want to double smuggle or does player 3 want to double fold space? And you end up in a scenario where, okay, now player 4 is either forced to, in most cases, in this exact scenario, player 4 is going to hit wealth. They're either going to hit wealth or they may, depending on the combat, hit Hardy Warrior. But when you do this, player 4 has now hit wealth. Player 1 has hit Research Station. Player 2, assuming they hit Fold Space as their first action. Fold Space smuggling does not matter. If one of those was their first action, their second action, in maybe 80-90% of games that get played out, their second action is either hitting Carthag. If wealth is open and they can hit it, sure, if they went Fold Space, they're not going to hit wealth. If they went smuggling, they'll hit wealth. But their second action is either going to be hitting Carthag to get an intrigue, or if there is a good tech tile up for grabs, / they can get the extra influence to buy a good tech tile or to buy a good Imperium Row card, they're going to hit Negotiator. Whichever one they don't hit, chances are the player after them, which is player 3. Player 3 is going to hit one of those spots. Carthag, Wealth, Negotiation.
So I don't want to cut you off. I am fascinated. I think, bow down to your superior knowledge of the this turn order. You've really spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I want to just get Lannister in here to comment on it too, because I think that he adds an interesting kind of like balancing act of consideration of combat. So I'd like to hear what he has to say about choice of space, especially during the first 2 rounds, setting up for combat, and identifying combat spaces or combat viability.
So, this is a good segue because I was actually going to interject on what Dreizo was saying. Like, if everything is set in turn order, the first and fourth place are pretty much screwed. But combat makes it possible to kind of skip the queue or get ahead of the queue through secondary or primary rewards. So a lot of combat spaces, the secondary rewards or primary rewards have Solari driven concepts to them. So there's a lot of times where people will come into combat to try to come into the queue, and that is actually an important distinction to make. It's important that even though it's just for Solari, sometimes you have to commit heavy into that combat so that you can get ahead of that queue. I'll give you an example. This is a match roughly 4 months ago with Q, and I remember distinctly the match because it was a huge commitment on his side. It was the 6 Solari combat, and I had shoved in something like 4 troops just to get 6 Solari because I had 2. He committed a highliner on top of me in order to get me 2 less Solari. and the reason is not spiteful. It made perfect sense because I was next in turn order to get the Swordmaster. And by him denying me that 2 Solari, he pushed me all the way from the first person to get the Swordmaster to the last person.
Brutal.
And as a combat individual with less actions, that is really disruptive, and you lose a lot of resources as well. So, in terms of placement, sometimes even though it's not beneficial for you immediately, it kind of polices you for the future. So it kind of protects the table from you running away, and it doesn't make sense initially. Like you feel like it's spiteful, but when when you take a look at that particular picture, um, anyway, when I saw it, I was like, yeah, I totally agree with that move because the initial reaction was obviously shock. I was like, what the hell? And then when I took a step back, I was like, yeah, it makes perfect sense because it helped him get ahead of the queue. It prevented me from dominating where I'm supposed to dominate, and that is very important in terms of how things line up for you. Because, as Dreizo pointed out, if you are later in the queue, that could translate to 4 or 5 less actions overall in the game. And as we mentioned, just 2 or 3 experimentations could translate to an extra bump, spice, cube for T-Lax purchase. So it's a lot of resources that you're kind of leaving out on the table, and a lot of points that you're leaving out on the table. Quite often, the difference from a turn 7 and a turn 8 finish is in fact that beetle bump. Like you'll see a lot of games where Dreizo or I finish just with that one beetle bump to get that 1 point, and that beetle bump could have been acquired through that one action that we were missing. And that turn order makes a big difference in that, and you have to have the preparation to get into combat, heavy into combat, to try and jump that queue. That's how you kind of find your cheat code. And this is where my unorthodox plays come in. Like sometimes you can't go heavy into combat. Like I'll give you an example. There was one game where somebody chose Beast and Romber, and I was like, oh crap, what am I left with? So I went with Memnon, and I chose to go into Haga Basin first round for 2 spice, and I put in just enough troops to get 2 spice from the secondary rewards for 4 spice, and I immediately went to Conspire the next round because I was the only one who had the spice. So I immediately racked up 5 Solari from that, and 2 Solari from having hit wealth from the previous round. So I was set up to be the second person to get the Swordmaster by doing something a little unconventional. So sometimes, although you're stuck by position, you're not necessarily stuck by the moves. You don't have to follow all the meta moves. You can kind of find your way out. You just have to think a little bit outside the box. Dude. Don't think I have to hit still suits. I have to hit wealth. I have to hit, you know, smuggling turn 1. Like make an adjustment for yourself. The adjustment, as Badger would tell you, is integral to being a great player, and that can really make the impact in terms of combat or secondary rewards from combat, I should say.
So just to reiterate for everyone, it sounds like what you're saying is, there's a lot of meta moves out there. There are a lot of double smuggle, double fold space, these things that we know are kind of they get you ahead because they've been tried and true. A lot of people do them, and they get you to access to spaces or access to what you need to get ahead in the game, either a Swordmaster or the interstellar shipping or something like that. But maybe what you're saying is actually pay attention to those combat rewards because they help you get to those spaces, but not through the normal channels. So they let you kind of jump ahead of others who might be doing it through the normal channels, and that could help you get ahead of them in the queue of Swordmaster, or for instance, getting a memo quarters that gets you up to shipping ahead of the other person. Say if you're Leto or something like that, you can get 2 bumps an unorthodox way. Again, Leto, it's orthodox, but just paying attention to those rewards spread out across the board and on the the combats. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, sounds about right.
I mean, just to give a little bit of just to get some opinions here.
Sure.
Would you say that guaranteeing either turn 3 or turn 4 is the 6 Solari combat would be a bad decision for the game?
Back in the homebrew section, I think it's bad.
Not even to like homebrew it, but just to like add it as just a part of the base game. Because just, as a, like, again, right now, as I said, the majority of games, the first 3 rounds are essentially scripted as to what turn you're in and what actions you're going to be taking.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, combat fluctuates it a little bit, but if we just guaranteed that either round 3 or round 4 would be the combat that has 6 Solari, wouldn't that change the meta so that, if player 3 has the option of hitting Fold Space or Hardy Warriors, they can guarantee that they get their Swordmaster first hitting Hardy Warriors if they can win the combat.
I think
But-
I do agree with you in the sense that I do want some consistency in combat, but I think also what makes Dune a great game is the variance that comes with it, and unfortunately that's kind of the thing that we kind of have to live with, because that variance is what makes it great and bad at the same time. Like it gives a chance for someone of lesser skill to kind of make up grounds, in my opinion. And if it was just purely like a chess game where it's set in stone, it's going to be pretty hard to keep that player base there, which is why I think. Although I agree with you, I would definitely prefer that type of consistency. I just don't think that it would work for the wide audience.
I mean,
I
what
agree.
right
So-
now we have round 1, round 2, round 3 conflicts, right?
Mm.
The game is designed for 10 rounds where there's 5 round 2 conflicts. Sorry, 6? 6 round 2 conflicts. No, 5 round 2 conflicts. There's 1 conflict 1, 5 conflict 2s, and the rest of the 4 rounds are conflict 3s. Maybe redesign the conflict 2s so that we have, a system of conflict 1, conflict 2, conflict 3, and then even a conflict 4, where the current conflict 3 turns into a conflict 4, but the amount of conflict 2s we currently have get readjusted so that the ones that give you, say, a double shipping bump in a troop are more likely or weighted higher to be early in. That would
So yeah, I agree with that. So I think that that's a good idea. I think that the game could have done that, where we have, like, say, rounds 2, 3, and 4, or maybe 2, 3, and 4 are economy combats or something like that, and 5 and 6 are victory points or vice versa, something like that. I think that that's a cool idea. Like, I think all of these, and I think that it's not a bad thing to to tweak, or we can do those sorts of things through the usual channels, like maybe just test things out and see how they go and play with them. But one of the things that I think that makes Dune interesting and also accessible is that it's very easy to set up. There's not a lot you have to really do. I mean, with Immortality, there's more, but it's not that much, really. And the combats are one of the more fiddly things you actually have to do, right? You shuffle up the 1s, you take one of them, shuffle up the 2s, you deal 5 out, put them under the 1s. You know what I mean? Like, so that sort of thing, even though, like, for us, because we play a lot online, it becomes a barrier to players in real life. And so while I think that it makes a lot of sense to have this kind of perfect balance of combats where we'd love to see them, that would help out the turn order, I think that it's maybe an unnecessary change for the sake of that high level play, which is not necessarily what the game was designed for. I mean, we have this community that's awesome and does a lot of high level play, high elo play, but that is probably not what the designers intended when they made this game, and I'm almost certain it's not. So I think while I think it's cool and I think we should definitely try it out as a community, I don't know if it's something that I would want from like a Dune 2.0 or something like that.
I'm just, my brain is kind of redirected towards how do we, or what are the solutions or even meta changes that would make position 1 and 4 more viable. Because
Sure.
again, in the current meta, it's like in the majority of games, unless player 1 hits smuggling first, players 2 or 3 are going to be running away with it. And that all boils down to the fact that player 1 ends up having an action economy of around 15 on average, while players 2 and 3 end up closer to 20 action throughout the
Yeah. No, that's a viable. I mean, I think it's a legitimate problem that I think maybe there's a way for this to be balanced from the meta perspective as opposed to like a hard change to the game. Like I guess my question is there a way for the first position to be a little bit more consistent and play into its strengths versus trying to do the things, the meta things, maybe in that sort of sense. Like that's what I want to kind of talk about.
So
Even fourth position too.
So, as I said before, the way you kind of disrupt that is by kind of breaking out of that mold, either through combat or through various spaces that are less explored. And this is kind of why I'm comfortable with the current ranking and all that, because I want to break out of that mold. That turn order is something that is really huge in this. It's highly determinant. Even the stats from Cheesables tournament showed clearly that second position is predominantly the most powerful spot or position, I should say. And
we've known that for a while, though. I mean, this isn't new information.
Yeah, it's just it mattered in the sense that in emo, is it even more so, less so, etc. And in that respect, I would say that it's very important for you to kind of explore new options. And for me, I think it's important to go through different spaces and through heavier commitments into fights that you don't think that are necessarily important at the time. You don't know what combat's coming up next. You just know what combat is currently available at this time. So when you see 2 Spice or 2 Solari, 2 Spice doesn't seem like much, but in the grand aspect of things, if like you hit Hagab's Basin and you get 2 Spice from the secondary rewards, that's 4 Spice. That can get you a tech tile. That can get you, Conspire Spice or Solari, I should say. It has a lot of different applications to it. You shouldn't be kind of stuck in that meta mold, and I think that being stuck in that meta mold kind of makes you stuck in that whatever turn order you're in is whatever win percentage you're stuck with. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Like, if you want to get out of that mold of that win percentage, you got to break out of that meta positional play.
So I wanted to bring something up that one of our Landsred patrons has said about first position. He said this is Sailor, who very good player. He said that he's having a lot of success at first position by not doing the sort of default shipping strategy, but doing other things entirely, specifically with Ilbani, Kaz, Yuna, and Romber. And so I wonder if this also plays into what Dreizo was saying, in that the other players can go ahead and have shipping and they can have the extra actions, but you have to kind of like one up them in terms of the potency of your actions, right? Or you can do stuff. I know that Lannister, you love doing this, playing Romber in first position and getting the round 6 Swordmaster, because that allows you to get back into the combat queue, making sure that you could fight for that 2-point combat, right? But kind of going about your way, doing your own thing in the meantime, and getting points elsewhere. So, getting dreadnoughts and pressuring combats, getting those rewards is extremely potent. And you can do that and not do the traditional shipping, or just go straight up Swordmaster. So I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, or either of you had thoughts on that.
Yeah. So traditionally, if you're giving up the shipping, you're getting other things in placement. Sort of like what you discussed earlier. If you're in wrong positional order, you can get pushed out of combat. By you giving up shipping, you kind of make the other person go shipping, or the other go smuggling, and it kind of pushes two people out of combat for you. So, first person chooses shipping, let's say, so they go space and go full space. Third person goes to smuggling, or vice versa. And now it only leaves one person effectively for you to deal with. And the beauty of that is they have to make that choice immediately. And if they don't make that choice immediately, then you get the next spot in, and you've guaranteed your win in that combat. So, in that respect, when you sacrifice those middle to late game benefits, you gain the benefits of the immediate rewards of that combat, and it gives you the highest potential for getting ahead, or at least committing as many as you feel you need to win that combat.
What Lannister said is very accurate, but also very. It's kind of heavily dependent on what the first combat is. Like, I'll be honest, right off the bat, in my opinion, I don't know if my opinion is the correct one. Like, I'll just preface it by saying that. But if the first combat ends up being the strongest combat, in my opinion, is the one that gives you a bump and a spice for winning. Not a shipping bump, but like an actual faction bump and a spice. And in that combat, like, second position is also an amazing thing to get, because that 2 spice early on can really set you up. Like Lannister said, it lets you get an early conspire if you need. It's very combat dependent, and you can't always rely on it. Which is where, yeah, the fun and the randomness of Dune is kind of what makes things great. But when your entire pace of the game can be dictated by what happens on round 1 or round 2 itself, it's the whole law of averages, right? If the majority of the time the first combat is garbage, even if you do have the flexibility of hitting hardy warriors in first position, what stops the second position? If person in position 2 is playing a beast, Beast understands that if I just do double smuggling, I start with the 1 Solari, so I don't need to worry about other facts. Like, yeah, it's a lot of ifs and buts, but there's 2 combat ones that there's 2 skirmish combats that give you a victory point. There's the 2 new skirmishes that were added with Rise of Ix that give you a faction bump, and either give you a faction bump and either a troop or a spice.
A shipping bump, you mean?
The shipping bump. Shipping bump with either a troop or a spice. Or there's the 2 that give you a faction bump with either Solari or spice.
I'm interested. You said that you like the one with spice more than the one with Solari. I thought that's interesting. I always valued the one that gave the faction bump, and then the second place is Solari probably the most.
I think it's because Dreizo and I value techs into specific faction spots quite heavily. So
that makes sense.
So, for example, I like selective breeding a lot. I also like certain techs as well. Dreizo loves his disposal facility, so that's there. He's aiming for that spice immediately. So, Solari is great, but spice gives you more option, because spice can be converted to Solari, but the same can't be said about Solari on normal circumstances.
Yeah, the spice has a free value, because Solari can't be like the 3 Solari for second place. That 3 Solari still needs you to get another 5, which you're either getting 4 spice for conspiring, so let's look at it this way. If hypothetically your first if this was the combat, second place is 3 Solari. If your first action is to hit still suits to get the water to set yourself up for a bunch of spice later on, what's your second action? And what are you sacrificing? Because an early full space is huge in this game. That early, especially like the later into the game we go, the less valuable full space. And I'm not talking about the board space itself, I'm talking about the card.
The card, yeah.
The later in the game we go, the less value is in that card. But early on, everybody only has a diplomacy and a Seek Ally. So that early go anywhere card that also replenishes itself by drawing another card, it gives you more influence to buy a potential upgrade or any card on the Imperium row. And it's that flexibility of So the full space is one factor on why it's more important in the early game compared to the water. But the other thing is that two spice gives you that freedom, or the two spice as a second place gives you a lot more freedom. Because if you manage to secure second place, you could always the one starter water you have, you can always hit Haga even for a 2+0 to get your 4. Then get your remainder 5 Solari from Conspire, which also replenishes troops, which is quite big because unless you're playing a beast or well, Beast is the only one that naturally is generating troops. Princess is also arguably really good. She's, in my opinion, a very strong character. She's just extremely hard to master. And it's very easy to shut down a princess. Like if a princess is sitting ahead of you and you keep hitting smuggling, you've basically gimped the princess. It's also very easy to take it like blind picks, hidden picks kind of fixed it. But if there is a princess in your game or in your lobby, characters like Ilban or even Leto become a lot stronger because that passive Solari you're generating can seriously snowball you. And princess is more than likely gonna be cashing for Solari instead of Spice because when you hit smuggling, that 6 Solari you get from cashing out, you spend an extra one, like 7 gives you a faction bump, a troop, and a spice. So essentially, the trade-off of giving other people 1 Solari each is a huge reward for you personally. But the main thing is the spice, like the Solari early, what are you doing with 3 Solari? You might get a Mentat, you might, if the stars align with 3 Solari, you might hit Still Suits, then you hit Great Flat, then you hit Conspire on a different turn. You need to get both your faction access cards drawn for you to be able to pull that combo off. And that's the only time that 3 Solari is going to turn into a lot more value for you. Unless you're playing Ilban or I'd argue Spice is still more valuable for Leto, but unless you're playing Ilban, that 3 Solari is not really a game changer for you. That 2 Spice still gives you that freedom of, hey, I can pivot into a Conspire. I can selective breed in case a really good card shows up early on. Or in the majority of cases, you've got, let's see, tech tiles like Shuttle Fleet. Getting 2 Spice early could be the difference between, and I've seen this happen in games where first action round 1, you're hitting Haga Basin, you take 2 Spice +0, toss 2 troops in. Your second action, in a standard game, right? If I'm in third position, there's a 6 cost, either Holtzman Engine or Shuttle Fleet up there. Hit Haga Basin, get the 2+0, toss 2 troops in. Chances are player 1's going to avoid combat because player 1's at unless player 1 is committing minimum 2, sometimes 3, maximum 4 troops into combat, you're not gonna want to commit into the combat, especially if it's a combat that has like a second place gives you 2 spice type of thing.
Right.
And when you know that player 3 already has 2 troops and they have an action ahead of you, you don't really want to commit into that. And that spice just has a lot more flexibility. Like you have a lot of good tech tiles. You've got your just the cheap ones that I would say are absolutely amazing to get early on are hollow projectors, mimic film, artillery, disposal facility, memo quarters. Lannister would say Sonic Snoopers is also in that list, but to me, it's a little bit of not a huge priority card. Like troop transports, training drones, those exist as well that cost 2 or 3, and wind traps also cost 2. Well, detonation costs 3. But in terms of big priority cards that in the early game can really shift your tempo, it's the memo quarters, hollow projectors, and mimic film. Where that 2 spice, if you get second place in combat, just that 2 spice gets you an early hollow projectors, which people underestimate the power of hollow projectors. Essentially, you're cycling 6 cards in your deck every turn, or not every turn, but every round, instead of the standard 5 cards. Yes, it's not as good as Holtzman Engine, because Holtzman Engine is a flat-out 6, but it's a tech that costs you half as much. And even in games where, if there's an early spy satellite, you could hit Haga Base and toss 2 troops in. As your second action, play your dagger up to negotiation to get your discount over there. And the next round, you could buy spy satellites before anyone can do anything. Which in Immortality is not as important because the game lasts a little bit longer. So you end up not benefiting as much as you did in the past from it. But in a best case scenario, 2 spice Haga Base and 2 spice combat second place. You've got your 1 negotiator up there. You're getting an early invasion ships, shuttle fleet, Holtzman engine. And those are huge technologies. Those are very massive tech tiles because shuttle fleet, if you manage to pull it off even on round 3, that tactile alone is going to give you your 8 Solari passive.
Mm-hmm.
And that freedom of having 2 Solari every round, the freedom of being able to say, I can go to Mentat, I can get my High Council, I can get a Dreadnought if I want to. Having that luxury is huge.
Well, Lenny, did you have anything to say for the closing comments? I know we've been at it for about an hour and 20 minutes, which I think is pretty good. So let's kind of wrap up our thoughts here about turn order. Yeah, and go from there.
Sure. Back to what you said on the first turn order. What you can do to break out of the mold. The first thing I would say is for position 1, I would say 90% of the time it's a bad idea to do Hardy Warriors first turn. Reason being, just for simplification, is you put in the 4, that's not safe because other people can double deploy on you and you end up having to overcommit on that. And so it's important for you to never go Hardy Warriors as the first player. You need to go Still Suits, Wealth, Smuggling, Bold Space. One of those.
What if you're Baron?
If you're a Baron, you can go Hardy Warriors, but just expect that if there's a Beast, you're kind of screwed because you're going to have to overcommit and people might get in between you. And when you overcommit, what does that mean? You basically are out of the combat for the next 2 to 3 turns. And that can really accelerate the entire table. I think I've seen that several times off of regular games, and I think that's kind of what throws off the balance of the table when people make that mistake. And there's a power vacuum in turn 3 and 4 where there's a lack of troops, and the turn order matters in that effect, and who has troops also matters in that effect. And when you exercise that Hardy Warriors in turn 1 as the first player, you're basically damning the whole table, I would say, for the reason I specified earlier. So that's my closing statement there. Like, do anything but Hardy Warriors, basically.
Dreizo?
Yeah. I don't fully agree with Wealth as your first action turn 1 unless you're... The only time I'd Wealth as first action turn 1 is if I'm playing a princess who hasn't gotten any triangles. If I'm playing Duke Leto and I have double diplomacy plus my signet ring. Actually, not even that, because you don't have your spice to benefit from signet ring. But the only time I'd Wealth as first action first player is if I'm immediately benefiting. Like Elban, deck cycling, there's a good 7 cost card up for grabs, like a Jessica early on.
Well, let me tell you about the story of the double dreadnoughts.
Well, yeah.
Well, yeah, those are exceptions where if you're playing a beast and there's a good... if there's an artillery up there, you're playing a beast. Then yeah, you can kind of gamble and go for, hey, let me take Wealth and then take artillery with a dreadnought nice and early. But those are, again, the 10% of scenarios. In 90% of cases, you probably want to be hitting full space. Now, I'd argue that the time, or there is good times to hit Hardy Warriors as first position, first player. But the majority of those times are if you're playing a Hundrel where you know what the next intrigue is. You're playing a Tessia where you plan to signet your faction away. You're playing a Baron who, even as Baron, depends on your hand, right? But
what if you have double daggers in hand?
Yeah, if you're playing a Baron, you have double daggers, go for it. It's not really a punishing move for you. Plus, again, you set up that whole cycle of player 2 now has to choose full space or smuggling.
Just as a note, there's a reason why me and Frank really like Hundro in position 1 is because it has the opportunity to do a double smuggle on turn 1. So you can obviously use the regular experimentation for smuggling and Signet to go smuggling again. So he can kind of jump.
He cheats.
Yeah, he kind of cheats on that sense. So if you're ever jammed on what to do, if Hundro's available to you at position 1, that's an option for you, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. Hundra is a very, very strong turn 1 or position 1 leader simply because of that. He can jump. He's almost like Leto, but for the shipping track. I mean, he can kind of get up ahead of people, which is very good. But yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you to Dreizo and thank you to Lannister for taking the time to talk with us today. Thank you all. We'll see you on the next one, and have a good night.
Thanks. See you guys.
All right. See you guys.